Okay, so we left off last time with Libya occupying much of or most of Chad, a provisional government nominally in charge of the country, led by a man named Gukune Wade, who was a Tubu from northern Chad and whose own armed movement, the Forces Armées Populaires or Armed Popular Forces, was also mostly composed of Tubu fighters. But they were allied with several other movements, including the original army of the Chadian Republic, the Forces Armées Tchadiennes, who are often referred to as the FAT, the Chadian Armed Forces, mainly composed of southern Chadians, or Sahara. And then there was a group called the CDR, the Conseil Démocratique Révolutionnaire, led by a man named Asil Ahmad, who was a Chadian Arab, and his constituency was mainly Arab. So you have a multi-ethnic, multi-armed group coalition in this transitional government, which has nominally legitimate power in Chad. And it's recognized by most countries at this point, or many countries at this point, and it is backed by the Libyan army, which is occupying much of the country. On the other side of the ledger, you have Hissène Habré and his Forces Armées du Nord, or Northern Armed Forces, based in Sudan, launching guerrilla attacks against the Libyan army and against the Gunt forces. And this is until May 1981. His group was supported in a semi-clandestine way by the French and also by the newly elected Reagan administration in the United States, who sought to get Libya out of Chad by any means necessary, and that included by supporting rebel groups opposed to Libyan control over the country. So, on May 10th, 1981, François Mitterrand was elected president of France. And let's get you a nice picture of him. Here you go. That is François Mitterrand. He beat Giscard d'Estaing, who was the previous president, in the second round of the presidential election. And his Socialist Party was actually came to power as a coalition party with the Communist Party, the French Communist Party. So as you can imagine, in the context of the Cold War, this definitely elicited some suspicions from the American side about the actual leanings of his government and where they intended to lead France on the international arena. And it's true that although Mitterrand would later adopt a very interventionist policy in Africa, much like his predecessors, at the beginning in Chad and elsewhere, he looked to distance himself from previous French policies. Especially with regard to Libya, and he certainly distanced himself from the kinds of Cold War centered or American centric views that saw either the Soviet Union or Libya as being the source of all problems on the African continent, especially in Chad. So the first problem he had to deal with was to kind of figure out what to do with Libya, because as we mentioned before, France had a rather contradictory approach to Libya, at times aiming for appeasement, at times aiming for confrontation. And in fact, the previous French military intervention in Chad, Opération Taco, which lasted from 1978 to 1980, had aimed to prevent Libyan advances in Chad and to prevent Libyan-backed rebels from taking over the country. And that obviously failed. Because now Libyan army not only occupied Chad, but a weak coalition of different political parties was nominally in charge of the country, and their entire survival was dependent upon Libyan support and aid. So in June, Mitterrand convened an interministerial task force to settle on this is June 1981 to settle on a Libyan policy, and it came to very disappointing conclusions. And although it said that it concluded that Libyan and French interests were completely incompatible in Africa, France didn't have enough leverage to significantly change Libyan behavior. Particularly, it pointed to Libya's substantial and modern arsenal, combined with more than 6,000 troops in Chad, and an ability to rapidly escalate its presence there, gave them sort of escalation dominance that made it too risky for France to attempt a military intervention, at least directly. And furthermore, the kind of covert efforts to assassinate or overthrow Gaddafi, which Giscard had attempted several times, weren't likely to work given Libya's strong security services and its lack of a structured opposition. In other words, there weren't any really valid kind of opposition figures that the French or anybody else could lean on to oppose Gaddafi. And indeed, Giscard, Mitterrand's predecessor, already made 2 failed assassination attempts against Gaddafi, and both of them had failed pretty miserably. So in Chad, this meant the continued French recourse to diplomacy to try to encourage Libyan forces to withdraw from the country. The main strategy that Mitterrand adopted here was to try to detach Goukouni and his Gunt coalition from Libya by offering substantial levels of economic assistance and support for the deployment of a Pan-African peacekeeping force to Chad, which was originally called for in one of the peace agreements signed that the Gunt had signed earlier in 1979. Meanwhile, he accompanied this by ending all covert assistance to Hissène Habré's forces. And he also tried to convince Habré's other backers, principally Egypt and Sudan, and most importantly the United States, to cut their assistance to Habré as well. And the French argued forcefully that this kind of assistance simply prolonged Chad's conflict and encouraged Libyans to remain in the country. And by removing the Habré threat, they could remove the Libyan pretext to be in Chad, and therefore the Libyans would leave. American officials, in turn, didn't see any contradiction in between their support for Habré and efforts to mobilize the OAU. The OAU was the Organization of African Unity, which is the predecessor to the African Union. And they were working on kind of trying to mobilize different African states for peacemaking efforts in Chad to get Libya to leave, and also to eventually have elections in Chad and a new constitution and a legitimate government. However, the Americans did tell the French they were willing to reconsider their position on support to Habré if Goukouni would succeed in asserting his independence from Gaddafi and somehow getting the Libyans out of Chad. Now, by October 1981, this had become a real possibility. Goukouni and most of his Gunt had begun to chafe under Libyan heavy-handedness. Gaddafi's support for one of the Gunt factions, the CDR, the Arab faction led by Asil Amat, this exacerbated tensions within the Gunt. So within the Gunt itself, there was quite a bit of tension. And this also exacerbated overall kind of Chadian resentment towards Libya among different faction leaders. And this led to armed clashes between Gunt factions, particularly the CDR, which was backed by Libya, and the rest of the provisional government. Goukouni, in particular, feared that Gaddafi was going to try to overthrow him, to remove him through a coup d'etat or something else. And on October 16th, he sent a frantic appeal to Paris for assistance, and Mitterrand responded immediately. On October 22nd, he sent a public cable to Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi, who then held the annually rotating chairmanship of the OAU. And in it, Mitterrand dramatically called for the emergency creation and deployment without delay of an international peacekeeping force to Chad to replace the Libyan army and therefore remove the need for the Libyans to protect the government against Hissène Habré. And by international peacekeeping force, I mean an African peacekeeping force. He promised French assistance to financially and logistically help the deployment of the force, but he excluded any direct French military participation, as this would have been viewed as neo-colonial, and also it went against the initial principles of his African policy. Then he moved even further than that. On October 25th, he began to supply Goukouni's own armed movement, the FAP, with over 25 tons of small arms and ammunition, and French officials made this public a couple days later. So both this cable to the African Union and his arms deliveries to Goukouni, they sent a clear warning to Gaddafi to rein in his ambitions and to overthrow Goukouni, or to replace him with a more pliable leader, or to undermine OAU efforts to replace the Libyan army. They also provided Goukouni and his allies within the Gunt with the moral support necessary to assert themselves against the Libyans. And on October 29th, Goukouni convened the entire provisional government, who voted to formally request the Libyans withdraw from Chad. This was quite a bold move. There were fears among French and other observers that Gaddafi would simply react by overthrowing them and replacing them with somebody more pliable, and he didn't do that. Instead, he acted far more swiftly than anticipated. He not only rapidly accepted the demand, but he withdrew his entire army from Chad within 2 weeks. And this came as a complete shock to the French and just about everybody else. But it's important to note that Gaddafi was slated to become the OAU chairman the following year, with the organization's annual meeting to be held in Tripoli. And the Gunt was the internationally recognized government of Chad, so defying its authority would have undermined Gaddafi's diplomatic standing on the continent and probably cost him his promised chairmanship, which was an important diplomatic goal that he had for some time. And he probably also understood the weakness of the support base within Chad itself. So the sheer speed of the Libyan withdrawal, though it attested to what French and Gunt observers viewed as Libyan resentment at their treatment by the Gunt and Gukuni, also left a power vacuum, which any kind of African peacekeeping force deployment couldn't fill for quite a long time. At the same time, though, Mitterrand viewed this withdrawal as a major French diplomatic triumph and a clear foreign policy success for his new administration. He could show that he could solve a mess that his predecessor couldn't get out of and help to create. And meanwhile, Gukuni also emerged from this ordeal strengthened by the removal of a foreign occupier and the consequent marginalization of the CDR, as the Arab armed group that threatened that was close to Libya and threatened his own position in Chad. His confidence was further bolstered the next month in November as he signed an agreement with the OAU regarding the modalities and mandate of this new OAU peacekeeping force. And this agreement emphasized on ensuring, and I quote, the safeguarding of the security of the Chadian state, which suggested or implied that the OAU force would help to protect the Chadian government against Hissène Habré and his advances in Chad. And meanwhile, that same month, Egypt and Sudan ended their support for Habré, whose main usefulness for them was his opposition to Libya and the pain he was inflicting on the Libyans. And with Libya at least temporarily removed from the picture, there wasn't any longer a reason to keep on supporting him. And the Reagan administration also ended their covert support to Habré at the same time. Instead, American officials started to put considerable effort to pushing for a rapid OAU force deployment, and they agreed to provide considerable funding for the mission as well. So far, so good. Unfortunately for Gukuni, though, his agreement with the OAU was only a temporary one, a provisional one. The troop-contributing countries, which were Senegal, Nigeria, and Zaire, had no interest in fighting a bloody counterinsurgency campaign, especially against Habré's FAN, who were had experience with not just guerrilla fighting in the countryside, but also urban combat, and probably far outclassed, at least in terms of their abilities and experience and training, any regular army troops any African country could bring forward. So at the end of November, the troop-contributing countries, as well as OAU diplomats, started to pressure the Gunt to sign an agreement regarding the force's mandate that explicitly stated the force would, and I'm quoting again, abstain from interfering in the internal affairs of the country. So although this OAU force, which is often described as the first African peacekeeping operation, reached some 4,400 troops by January 1982, it did not offer any help against Habré, whose forces continued to advance in eastern Chad. At the same time, the Gunt suffered from a number of major weaknesses. The most important lay in its complete lack of money. So here's an image of Habré reviewing some of his fighters in either eastern Chad or western Sudan, Darfur. That would have been in early 1982. So the Gunt had no money. It's a big issue. Years of civil war meant a moribund state administration and no taxes. Funds were collected by various armed groups in territories they controlled, and externally derived funds from international partners, including France, often disappeared into the coffers of one or another faction, particularly Gukuni's faction, which of course exacerbated divisions within the government itself. Additionally, faction leaders within the Gunt disagreed over what strategies to pursue regarding Habré, and some of them were pushing for negotiations. A lot of Southerners in the FAT, that's the older government armed forces, the Forces Armées Tchadiennes, the Southern faction, saw the conflict as a war between Northerners and didn't particularly feel inclined to sacrifice themselves to protect Gukuni. Meanwhile, the Chadian Arabs in the CDR, although they were well armed because of their support from Libya, they positioned themselves away from areas likely areas of Habré's advance, and kind of sat on the fence awaiting events. And this left Gukuni's armed group, the FAP, the Popular Armed Forces, as the only kind of viable armed group confronting Hissène Habré. Now, in the first few months of 1982, the FAN, Habré's armed group, managed to seize large portions of eastern Chad, as well as most of the BDT in the north. With supplies accumulated from earlier aid, plus captured material left behind by the Libyans, his veteran forces consistently outperformed their opponents, and Habré also benefited from limited and very unofficial support provided through contacts with the French intelligence agency, foreign intelligence agency, the SDEC, which would soon be renamed the DGSE. A lot of SDEC officials were disgusted by Mitterrand's leftism and his electoral alliance with the Communist Party, and some took to deliberately undermining his foreign policy by putting Habré into contact with notorious French mercenary Bob Denard. And Denard looked to bolster Habré's advance through recruiting advisors to help train his forces in the use of heavy weapons, also helping to repair and maintain his equipment and set up a communications network. Whether this aid was decisive or not is an open question, but it did provide a back channel between Habré and some of the less reputable elements of kind of French intelligence and mercenary underworld, which would kind of help him later on. And it should be noted that not too long after that, Mitterrand really cracked down on his intelligence agency and renamed it and restaffed parts of it to try to ensure that it was more in line with government policy and was not kind of running its own foreign policy for France. Now, as it became increasingly clear that Habré was going to win this war, pressure began building on Gikouni to negotiate. And the pressure came from the OAU and the troop-contributing countries, who threatened to withdraw their forces if he refused. Gikouni remained intransigent. He didn't have any reason to talk. It was clear that Habré's ambitions were no secret. He wanted to be the leader. There was no compromise really to be made with him, as past incidents had shown. And negotiations from Gikouni's point of view, and even from the point of view of even not very sympathetic CIA analysts, was that negotiations was tantamount to surrender. Unfortunately for Gikouni, though, the provisional government was in no position to win the war. The end came on June 7th, 1982, as Habré's forces got into Jamena, reached Jamena, and neither the FAT or the CDR opposed him in any way, and only a few hundred FAP fighters, that is Gikouni's own armed units, actually put up much resistance against Habré. Gikouni escaped into Cameroon, and for a brief period of time, Habré was in uncontested control of the capital and much of Chad. So, American officials, who, as I said, had ceased their support to Habré at the end of 1981, they welcomed his victory. The OAU solution wasn't one, and it was clear that the provisional government under Gikouni couldn't govern the country. They also viewed Habré as a moderate pro-Western leader, despite his bloody track record, and they viewed him as somebody whose nationalism made them wary of Libya, and somebody who could reliably serve as an anti-Libyan kind of bulwark against Gaddafi's expansionism. The French, on the other hand, were much more circumspect, and their initial concern was continued conflict in Chad and the general resentment that a lot of Chadians had towards Habré himself. Now, despite a lack of significant external aid, as I said, the Americans weren't directly helping Habré at this point. The French had cut off all assistance earlier, and there were kind of awaiting events in Chad. Habré took advantage as soon as he could to consolidate his power, and over several months he managed to gain control over southern Chad, which had so far escaped the control of most northerners. And he managed this by playing on southern dissensions and securing defections from the former FAT, the former government army. At the same time, towards the end of 1982 and early 1983, Libyan aid allowed a reconstituted Gunt and Armée Nationale de Libération, so National Liberation Army, or ANL, to effectively repulse multiple efforts by Habré's troops to retake territory in the north. And also to allow these groups to take control over Tibesti and Borku. So basically, at this point in time, Habré managed to secure some control over the south, but Gikouni and other members of the Gunt had managed to escape and then began to reconstitute themselves in the north as a rebel group and supported by Libya. Now, by June 1983, so this is a year after Habré took power, and Habré had more or less consolidated his authority in central Chad and southern Chad, although that would be threatened later on. He didn't have much control over the far north, and Libya was trying to redo what they had done in 1978, 1979, that is, help a fledgling rebellion, expand, capture territory, and then eventually move on to the Chadian capital, and then repeat what had happened, and hopefully in a way that was more beneficial to Libyan interests than before. Now, by June 1983, this new Gunt coalition was prepared for more substantial offensive operations. They'd been rearmed, they recruited more troops, and on June 24th, they managed to capture Faya Laljo. Faya Laljo is the capital of the BET. It's the major urban center of the BET. And in response, Habré requested French air support. This was a clear act of Libyan aggression against Chad, and France should help him. But Mitterrand only agreed to increase military assistance without openly intervening. He recognized the Libyan threat, but he didn't want French troops to get involved again. He did not want to intervene with his army. And he was hoping that would be enough to stabilize the situation. And to some extent, he was right. In July, although the situation deteriorated further with the ANL capturing Abaché in the east, Habré managed to rapidly turn the situation around. He was a very effective battlefield commander, and some of his subordinates, especially Hassan Jamous and Idriss Déby, were themselves very effective military commanders. He managed to enlist Zaire's dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko, to deploy troops to Chad, especially the capital, to secure his rear. And this allowed Habré to redeploy his own forces further north. And he took personal command of his elite troops, retook Abaché, and partly this was because the ANL, the new rebellion, were kind of victims of their own success. Their vast territorial gains came at the expense of extended lines of communication and equipment limitations. By the end of the month, Habré was threatening to retake Faya. However, the French warned Habré that any move on Faya Largeau was going to lead to more direct Libyan intervention, especially with air power. French intelligence predicted that if Habré failed to take Faya Largeau, he risked losing his best units, who deployed to the front, and this would leave nobody to face the ANL for moving on to Jamina and taking it. And this led French authorities to warn Habré against taking Faya, and they really feared this would lead to a major Libyan escalation. At this point, there weren't any mainline Libyan units involved in the fighting. They were supporting the ANL from a distance with logistical aid, intelligence, and most importantly, weapons and heavy weapons. But at this point, no Libyan troops actually got engaged directly. The French were worried that if Habré retook Faya Largeau, this would lead to a direct Libyan military intervention, which would then escalate and sort of force the French to respond. Habré knew this, and he attacked anyway. He captured Faya in person on July 30th, 1983, and this was accompanied by atrocities, as Habré's actions were often one to entail. Habré himself was notorious for his kind of bloody-mindedness and his willingness to use all sorts of violence against his enemies, real or imagined. So, in Faya, he captured 17 cabinet ministers of the rebel provisional government, the Gunt, and he executed all of them. Furthermore, he captured between 1,000 and 2,000 troops, 1,000 or 2,000 rebels, and these suffered horrific conditions of detention, and some 200 were massacred in cold blood. And as the French had predicted, immediately his forces were immediately subjected to Libyan airstrikes, and in response, Habré again requested French air support. Now, Mitterrand and his advisors were absolutely furious at Habré, and they suspected that the Americans had been encouraging him. It's not the first or last time that Mitterrand would view Habré's ties to the United States with suspicion. Mitterrand was always very suspicious of American motives, and feared that they were trying to displace France from its influence with its former colonies. But France's African clients and other countries were also really starting to panic. They're pushing for France to do something. And Mitterrand was resistant. He feared this would drag France into a conflict he wanted to avoid. At the same time, Habré was benefiting, and it had sort of received some mixed signals from the French. Even though Mitterrand was clearly against new intervention, Habré either was deliberately provoking a French intervention or had received enough mixed signals that he thought he had at least a yellow light, if not a green light, to move ahead with his attack on Faya. From before his seizure of power in 1982, as I mentioned, he had some very kind of off-the-book support from the French intelligence agency, SDEC. But by July 1983, the DGSE, in a more official way, although still clandestinely, organized weapons deliveries, including anti-tank missiles and advanced communications equipment. And these were accompanied by some 30 mercenaries to help train Chadian troops on their use and provide expertise with mortars and other heavy weapons. And these mercenaries also accompanied Chadian forces in their capture of Faya Laljo. And this may have given Habré the idea that Paris unofficially supported his actions. It also needs to be said that Habré and his supporters, both in Chad and in France, did an excellent job of exaggerating the equipment and capabilities of Gount's forces, which made his own victories seem much more impressive, and their enemies more formidable, which encouraged foreign support and intervention. That said, a large-scale intervention by Libya, and particularly with its air power, did allow Gount and Libyan forces to retake Faya Laljo in early August. But the scale of the Libyan involvement necessary to do that would provoke French intervention. Okay, so one thing to note about France's policy in Chad at the time was the ambiguity surrounding its relations with Libya. And this goes back to 1970 when it sold over 100 Mirage fighter jets to Gaddafi's new regime. Libya represented a market with billions of dollars of French exports, especially weapons. And this was at a time of severe pressures in the French franc and the French economy. So there was a tug of war between both people on Mitterrand's left, who viewed Gaddafi as an anti-imperialist icon, who wanted France to have good relations with him, and those in the French arms industry and other economic actors, especially in the energy industry, oil, which also pushed for good relations with Gaddafi because France and these companies profited enormously from exports to Libya. This led the kind of ambiguous French line on Libya to clash with the Americans, as one can imagine. American officials, especially Reagan, viewed Chad through a purely geopolitical lens, which is deeply informed by their ideological position in the Cold War. Libya was, for Americans, if it wasn't necessarily a Soviet pawn, and CIA analyses were careful to point out that the Kremlin could not control Gaddafi, but they still viewed Libya as a disruptive state whose subversive ambitions would surely serve Soviet interests if it was successful. Not to mention Gaddafi's investment in international terrorism, which really kind of marked him out as a wanted man for the Reagan administration. Now, France and its plethora of African clients and allies were also concerned by Libyan ambitions, but the French officials generally viewed Libya as more of a negative influence in Chadian politics rather than as a master puppeteer, and hence one that should be managed in more diplomatic ways than backing an untrustworthy Habré to the hilt. In any event, pressure from African leaders fearful of the Libyan threat and fears over France's standing as a global power did push Mitterrand into a more interventionist direction. He needed to show his African allies that he was a credible French leader, that he could protect them in case they were threatened in the future. So it was important that he demonstrate credibility now. One last trigger seems to have been the August 4th military coup in Haute-Volta, now known as Burkina Faso, which brought Thomas Sankara to power. And this may have been the catalyst for Mitterrand's decision to intervene. The links between Gaddafi and Sankara amplified a Libyan threat to the France's zone of influence. Sankara was, to varying degrees, kind of close to Gaddafi. And this increased pressure intervened to a fever pitch. So the French army began to deploy to Chad in August 1983 and drew a line in the sand at the 15th parallel. While this protected Habré's regime from the immediate threat of overthrow by Libyan forces or the Chadian allies, it also allowed Habré to conduct operations north of the line without having to worry about his rear. Now, in September 1983, already the Chadian army, the FANT, the Forces Armées Nationales Tchadiennes, which was now nominally a unified army, although it was still mainly Habré's Forces Armées du Nord, they managed to repulse several ANL moves towards Shaluba and Kurok Toro, but after the loss of French Air Force Jaguar and its pilot in January 1984, Mitterrand moved the Red Line up 100 kilometers to the 16th parallel. And although this made it look like France could, credibly protect itself and was making a credible commitment to protect southern Chad, Habré was rather upset with the French deployment. He was hoping that it would allow him it would help him to reconquer the north. By himself, he didn't have the means to do it. he would require much more direct assistance from the French or the Americans in order to achieve that. And Mitterrand's goal seemed to parallel Giscard's with the previous military operation in Taco, prevent a Libyan takeover of the country and to create conditions for negotiated settlement. The thing is, Habré would only accept Gaddafi as a counterpart for negotiations and not Gikouni or other rebel leaders. And he also refused to negotiate anything absent a full Libyan withdrawal from the country. And that included the northern bit, the Ozu Strip, which Libyans had annexed back in 1973. So this led the French to kind of try to look around for a solution, a third man solution, behind Habré's back. And through kind of secret negotiations with the Libyans, they tried to test the idea of different Chadian leaders who might replace Habré. But nobody could find a candidate suitable to both parties, the French and Libyans. At the same time, the OAU got involved, and they attempted to organize a meeting of different factions in Addis Ababa, but this didn't work out because Habré wouldn't be recognized as the head of state during negotiations, and he refused to accept this kind of humiliation. And subsequent mediation efforts failed for other reasons. So by early 1984, France was kind of stuck with Habré. There was no, from the French point of view, if they were intent on preventing a Libyan takeover of all of Chad, Habré was the only person they could bet on. And this isn't to say they liked Habré particularly. Mitterrand never liked him very much. Some French military officers respected the ability of his army movement, the FAN, to their fighting abilities, the generalship of its leadership, and its experience and its performance against the Libyan army. But there were others who resented Habré's role in assassinating or executing the French intelligence officer Pierre Galopin, which we discussed last time. And there was a lot of ambiguity around the French relationship with Habré. But at this point, by early 1984 rather, France didn't think they had any other choice but to kind of back him in some way or another. Now, the French deployment was large. It reached some 3,500 troops, and large by French standards. At the time, France was not able to deploy tens of thousands of soldiers to Africa. Especially at the height of the Cold War, when France needed most of its army in Europe. But even without that, its projection capacity didn't allow it to send more than several thousand troops at a time, and that was still quite a commitment. But this still made it the biggest French overseas deployment since the Algerian War. Now, Habré, as I said, wasn't happy about this deployment. He complained that it split Chad into two. And it gave the Libyans a blank check to consolidate their control over half the country. And this led lots of observers to kind of think, like they had in the past, that what really existed in Chad was kind of an implicit deal between France and Libya to split the country. Some people described it as a Franco-Libyan condominium. Others described it as a partition. But in any case, it was whether or not there was an actual deal between France and Libya, and I very much doubt there was an explicit agreement. The impact of this policy was an effective partition of Chad between Libyan and French spheres of influences. Now, at the same time, Chad was becoming a quagmire for Libyan forces. Logistical problems linked to distance made life difficult for Libyan troops. They also had to face increasing discontent among Chadian populations who resented Libyan heavy-handedness, and there were several hundred Gunt combatants that actually defected to Habré over the course of 1984. And also the rebel group, the Gunt itself, suffered from deep-seated antagonisms and fragmentation as conflicts between and among its factions, its ethnic constituencies, and leading personalities undermined its unity and its political cohesion, as it had when they were in power. Now, French goals at this point were not entirely clear, but by early 1984, French public statements suggested that their condition for an exit was a withdrawal by the Libyan army from Chad. So if Libya withdrew, France would withdraw. Semi-secret negotiations took place over the course of that year, and by mid-September 1984, France and Libya announced a mutual withdrawal agreement. Most of the French press greeted this news really warmly, but the deal was done behind Habré's back. And French authorities only informed him less than an hour before the deal was made public. So you can imagine this was not taken very well in N'Djamena. Now, the timing of the announcement, coming right before a planned meeting of Chadian factions in Brazzaville, also undermined Habré's outreach efforts to try to secure more defections. Rebel factions that had considered defecting to Habré while he had French protection now backed off as it became clear that France was leaving. Now, partly this lack of consideration may have been deliberate. Mitterrand saw Operation Manta as more of an anti-Libyan deployment than as a pro-Habré deployment. As I said, he didn't like Habré that much, particularly regarding his bloody management of insurgencies in southern and central Chad, and he didn't view him as a unifying figure who could reconcile Chad's various factions. The problem, though, with all of this was that, apart from some initial moves to demonstrate its commitment to the agreement, Libya didn't withdraw its forces, while France did. So, French officials continued to claim that Libya had abided by the agreement, but then it became a face-saving exercise. They had to claim that Libya withdrew, even though France had not withdrawn, because if France withdrew and Libya stayed, then it made the French position look ridiculous. But the Reagan administration undermined this by leaking satellite data to Habré's regime, proving Libyan duplicity. And this was probably because the French refused to go back on their commitment to leave Chad, even in the face of blatant evidence of Libyan deception. At the same time, from Mitterrand's point of view, French forces and air assets remained nearby in CAR, Central African Republic, and in Gabon, ready to redeploy if Gaddafi or the Guns made any serious moves on the Chadian capital, N'Djamena. They could react in a matter of hours. This reduced both the costs and risks of French military commitment while maintaining some level of deterrence. And also, Mitterrand kind of padded this blow of the French retreat by offering Habré a substantial increase in his military assistance. Now, meanwhile, at the same time all this is happening, southern Chad began to see substantial levels of violence. And this is one of the kind of big accusations against Hissène Habré and his governance of Chad during his tenure in office. Was the way that he reacted to these southern insurgencies and insurgencies in central Chad as well. So, although these were disorganized and sporadic, by 1983, this took the form of a variety of armed groups known as commandos or kodos, who targeted northern government officials and soldiers. And they also attacked the cotton harvest by burning crops on various occasions and seizing money. These kodo groups kind of arose in response to Habré's abuses, as well as disaffection among former southern military officers with this new political dispensation of northern rule. So, as part of his plan to both administer the South and to draw it into his regime, Habré had formally tried to integrate his own armed faction, the FAN, with the former government army, the FAT, and created this new army, the FANT. And it was nominally supposed to consist of mixed units and deployments to areas without regard to the ethnicity of the troops. But in reality, many of these units remained ethnically or factionally homogenous, and former government troops, former southern troops, often refused to fight and defected or joined kodo groups rather than get involved or serve as cannon fodder in what they saw as a war between northerners. But there was no coordinated uprising with the Gun to northern Chad or with Libyan support, which made it a lot easier for Habré to co-opt, divide, or bloodily repress parts of this opposition. And in this process, Habré's forces committed numerous atrocities. There's no estimate in the death toll, but we do know that several hundred villages were burnt to the ground, and there were a number of mass graves discovered by human rights investigators in later years. Now, in August 1984, just as the Habré regime and the coalition of Kodo leaders were about to kind of formally announce a ceasefire, the Kodos reneged, and they resumed their insurgency. And although the reasons for this are still unclear, it probably related to fears among southern soldiers about being split up and dispersed throughout the country in units with northern soldiers and officers in ways that could make them vulnerable to reprisals. And this fear was probably reinforced by insulting and threatening language employed by northerners regarding their eventual fate. So they kind of went back into rebellion. Habré saw this as a betrayal, followed up with very vicious repression. His presidential guard was particularly guilty of violence against civilians, and although, of course, the rebels themselves also committed abuses. International observers described parts of southern Chad as a wasteland. Cotton production fell drastically, and famine became a real problem in 1984 and 1985. Through 1985 and 1986, however, so this is kind of an interim period when French forces had withdrawn, and there was a kind of stalemate on around the 16th parallel between Habré's forces in Libya. Habré did manage to tame the southern insurgency and at the same time considerably weaken the Gunt coalition in the north. This is a big political coup for Habré. In the south, he managed this through a judicious mix of public diplomacy. He made an official visit in March 1985, admitting that his troops had committed crimes. He replaced the northern officials with southern ones. He punished and executed some guilty soldiers, and he co-opted some rebel groups with money. And much of that was provided by the French, as well as continued military operations to maintain pressure on these groups. So by the end of 1985, most of the southern insurgency had either rallied to the regime or was no longer in a position to seriously threaten central government control, which allowed Habré to redeploy troops to northern Chad. Meanwhile, through a variety of bilateral negotiations, which was his favorite tactic, Habré managed to secure piecemeal defections from parts of his Gunt rivals, and by early 1987, actually, he was effectively cooperating with Gakuni's old movement, the FAP. Even though Gakuni himself was out of the picture, he was in prison in Libya. Now, the Rump Northern Rebellion, called the Neo-Gunt, under the CDR leader Sheikh bin Omar, had now lost a lot of its credibility and support among northern populations. So these moves prepared the ground for a future offensive to retake northern Chad. And Habré's kind of agile diplomacy, combined with brutal and bloody counterinsurgency, allowed him to establish a level of control over the country that had not been seen since the 1960s, apart from northern Chad, of course. Now, the years 1986 and 87 saw a dramatic change in Chad and Libya's military fortunes, which would eventually put an end to this Chadian-Libyan conflict. Despite Libyan promises to withdraw, as we mentioned, something like 3,000 to 5,000 Libyan troops remained in northern Libya in support or nominal support to the ANL army. Libyan forces also dug in around strategic oases and airstrips such as Fada and Wadi Dum. They extended runways, airstrips. They built radar installations. They hardened runways as well, deployed anti-aircraft batteries, and heavily fortified all of these positions. And some of Libya's most advanced Soviet-supplied hardware was employed with its units in Chad for these purposes. Now, beginning on February 10th, 1986, Gunt rebels launched a series of attacks below the 16th parallel. And this responded to a desire among Gunt leaders and Gakuni, this is before he was put in prison, to break the stalemate and the phony war that Chad had found itself in following France's withdrawal. It also reflected the hope that the French would not respond militarily because they'd been out of Chad for a year and hadn't done much in between, especially given upcoming legislative elections which threatened to unseat Mitterrand's Socialist Party from Parliament. Now, the 16th parallel was a red line for Mitterrand, and credibility considerations certainly played a role in his decision-making. So on February 13th, France began to accelerate the delivery of arms and supplies to Habré's forces. On February 16th, France launched a major air raid against Wadi Dum, the first French major military operation north of the 16th parallel. Now, Wadi Dum was Libya's largest military installation in Chad, and it served as a centerpiece of their deployment in the country. It included a 3,600-meter-long airstrip defended by some 3,000 troops. And although French bombs only inflicted minor damage in the airstrip, Libyan repairs failed to secure the disturbed soil underneath the pavement, which made the airstrip unsuitable for the use of heavy aircraft going forward, which should prove to be quite beneficial for Habré's forces. So here you see a picture of France's bombardment of the Wadi Dum airstrip in February 1986. Now, the air operation against Wadi Dum, although it was conducted far to the north of the 16th parallel, signaled French commitment to protecting Habré's regime, and it damaged Libya's ability to provide air support for its forces or to Gunt formations operating in southern Chad. It also marked the beginning of France's new military deployment called Operation Epervier, or Sparrowhawk. Now, Epervier was conceived of as an air operation, and initially it consisted of 6 Mirage F-1 fighters and 4 Jaguar ground attack aircraft, and this was supplemented by radar based in Moussereau and Crotal and Hawk surface air batteries, as well as several companies of French troops for force protection. As I noted before, the Libyan presence in northern Chad continued to grate on local populations, and the hardening of Libyan bases and infrastructure projects, as well as the introduction of Libyan currency and arranged or forced marriages with Libyan soldiers, made it clear that Gaddafi intended to stay in northern Chad for a long time. Furthermore, the deployment of Operation Appelvier and the clear French commitment to protect Habre's regime made victory seem even less likely for the Chadian rebels. So this, combined with increasing resentment, culminated in October 1986, when large parts of the Tubu rebellion turned on its Libyan patrons. And this began with an attack by some of Goukouni's men against Libyan troops in Faya. And this is when Goukouni was arrested. He wasn't in Chad, he was in Libya. His troops attacked Libyans. Goukouni was arrested by Gaddafi. Although Libyan forces repelled the rebels, subsequent Libyan retaliation, which included airstrikes against Tubu forces in the BET, this led to massive defections to the government. So this was kind of the death knell of Libya's ability to sponsor effective rebel groups in northern Chad. Now it was just the Libyan army and the Chadian government army and now allied rebel groups that had kind of switched sides in order to fight the Libyans. France responded to all this with increased arms shipments, not just to Habré, but also to FAP troops in northern Chad, these Goukouni's former organization, as well as airdrops of supplies in the BET to other rebel groups as well. Now, Habré began to launch a more significant military operations after this, north of the 16th parallel, and this included the capture of Fada on January 2nd, 1987. And the tactics employed by Chadian commander, Colonel Hissène Habré, became famous. They kind of characterized the kind of fighting preferred by the Chadian army and the erstwhile rebels against the ostensibly well-equipped and better-equipped Libyan fixed defensive positions. And this included multi-pronged attacks by columns of pickup trucks mounted with anti-tank weapons, which included French and American-provided anti-tank missiles, charging at full speed, very high, between 60 and 80 miles an hour, as fast as you can go on hard ground, toward Libyan positions. And Chadian troops generally look to fight at close quarters as quickly as possible to prevent airstrikes and to limit the Libyans' use of heavy weapons, which was their strong point. Libyan units were not prepared for this kind of fighting at all, and this fighting could get to be hand-to-hand at times. Lots of descriptions of these battles mention hand-to-hand fighting. Libyan units fell apart in relatively short order. Jammus scored a major victory, killing some 780 Libyan troops, destroying or capturing 130 armored vehicles, including capturing weapons, radar, aircraft. Now, French military intelligence jumped on this. They traveled to Fada right after the battle to help train Chadian troops on using the new equipment. In exchange, the French were allowed to take some of it for themselves, including advanced Soviet surface air missiles and Hind helicopters. Now, Gaddafi retaliated. He launched a handful of airstrikes south of the 16th parallel, including one at Shaluba, which was in close proximity to a French forward base at Khalait. The French responded by again attacking Wadi Doum, knocking out its radar. They also increased the ground and air contingents of the French army in Chad, which reached some 2,200 troops, 11 Jaguar, and 8 Mirages by February 1987. Now, on March 22nd, was the kind of decisive moment of this conflict. So, following the destruction of 2 Libyan columns aiming to recapture Fada, Hissène Habré, the commander of the base at Fada, launched an attack against the Libyan base at Wadi Doum, which was commanded by a certain Khalifa Haftar, who some of you may be familiar with. Now, using tactics similar to those which had succeeded at Fada, Jammus overran the base's defenders. Libyans lost more than 1,700 troops. This included 1,269 dead and 438 prisoners, including Haftar, with no recorded wounded, which suggests that Chadian forces killed large numbers of them. Now, Jammus's forces also captured some $1 billion worth of military equipment. Some of it was top-of-the-line Soviet weaponry purchased by the Libyans. This included artillery, armored vehicles, surface air missiles, and radar systems. And much of this would eventually fall into the hands of Western intelligence, who paid good money for it. Several days later, Chadian forces moved on to Fire Laujo and took that as well. Now, later in the year, in August, a renewed Chadian offensive captured Uzu. This is the ultimate goal of Habre's offensive, was not just to get Libyan troops out of Chad, but to recapture the Uzu Strip, which Gaddafi had annexed and claimed was part of Libya. So, On August 8th, there was a renewed offensive against Uzu, which is the last major Libyan base in Chadian territory. It was the capital, sort of the Uzu Strip. Now, uh, following the failure of several bloody Libyan efforts to recapture it, Habré decided to redeploy the bulk of his forces there to conduct counterinsurgency operations against Hadjari rebels, which were initially part of his coalition in central Chad and around Jamina. And again, this is another instance of Habré committing some pretty horrific atrocities in the context of counterinsurgency. This gave the Libyans another opportunity to try to retake Uzu. And on August 28th, they retook the settlement. So, rather than run the risk of another assault against Uzu, which the Libyans certainly expected, Habré looked to reduce the ever-present threat posed by Libyan aviation, especially given the French refusal to help the Chadian army in the Uzu Strip. Now, Mitterrand's kind of goal for this was to try and end the conflict after Ouaddai Doum and then have negotiations. He wasn't interested in committing France to any kind of support for conquest of the Uzu Strip, whose status remained ambiguous. So most countries, including France, officially recognized it as being part of Chad. A lot of France's African allies thought it would be best to at least unofficially recognize it or unofficially accept it as Libyan territory in order to allow Gaddafi to save face and thus withdraw his troops from Chad in the context of a more general political agreement. Habré, however, wanted Uzu. It was his mission. It was his main kind of political goal, and he would do anything to get it. So, in light of the French refusal to help him in Uzu, he and his military commanders, especially Jammus again, they chose to launch a major raid against Libya's large Matan Asera air base, which is located some 90 kilometers north of the Chadian-Libyan border. The goal was to destroy as much military equipment, particularly aircraft, as they could, and do as much damage to the airstrip as possible in order to limit the Libyan aerial threat for as long as possible. The French opposed this and refused to provide any kind of intelligence or other support for it, and they feared that a failure would allow Gaddafi to reverse government gains over the previous months. Also, a Chadian attack into Libya would make Chad the aggressor, and France would stand accused of involvement by association. That said, Mitterrand did announce on September 3rd that the red line at the 16th parallel no longer applied, which implied that French protection extended over all of Chad, with some ambiguity remaining over the Uzu Strip. The idea was that this should provide a deterrent for any Libyan effort to reinvade the territory that it had lost. However, this may have encouraged Habré in his belief that if push came to shove, the French would intervene on his side as they had in the past. The U.S., on the other hand, encouraged it, of course, and they provided intelligence gathered by satellite to Habré's forces about the deployment and disposition of Libyan defenses around Matan Asara. The raid, which included the tactic of maneuvering around the base to approach it from a direction which its defenders would not expect an attack, succeeded beyond the regime's wildest dreams. There's Habré's regime. 1,000 Libyans were killed, another 400 were taken prisoner. The Chadian column also destroyed 29 aircraft, including attack helicopters, MiG-23s, and Mirage F-1 fighters. The Libyans retaliated with Tu-22 bomber attacks against the French base at Jamina, but their aircraft was shot down by French air defenses. Now, immediately following this raid, Habré was subjected to enormous pressure to agree to a ceasefire. Mitterrand feared being drawn into an open interstate conflict between Chad and Libya and didn't want France to be associated with any Chadian invasion, which might seem like some kind of neocolonialist plot. And meanwhile, the OAU also pushed hard for an end to the conflict. Gaddafi himself also had strong incentives to end the war. His human and material losses were enormous, with some estimates suggesting up to 8,000 Libyan troops were killed. 500 armored vehicles were lost, and 80 aircraft of various types destroyed or captured. The Soviet Union, his principal arms supplier, didn't do anything to hasten arms deliveries or replacement parts. And all of this potentially threatened his domestic situation. Large numbers of disaffected army officers and citizens were alienated and upset by the losses of loved ones and comrades and diverted investment, could all pose a serious threat to his regime. So, and added to this, his few remaining friends in Africa, including Burkina Faso and Algeria, they worked to persuade Gaddafi to back down and come to some kind of agreement. So on September 11th, 1987, a ceasefire was declared. And over the course of the next months, via OAU mediation, it was agreed that the Uzu issue would be submitted to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, for definitive ruling on the territory's status. Now, although these smashing victories marked the beginning of the end of the Chadian-Libyan conflict, which is sometimes referred to as the Toyota War, they also led to Habre's downfall. In addition to French troops and military assistance, Habré had, beginning in 1983, benefited from substantial American support in the form of weapons, money, and intelligence. And following 1987, Habré had increasingly leaned on American largesse at the expense of French support, much to the annoyance of French officials who were upset at perceived ingratitude and motivated by long-standing paranoia of American intentions. And in particular, the creation of the CIA-organized Haftar force, led by the former commander of Wadi Dum, which was a unit of dissident of Libyan troops, and aimed to kind of launch guerrilla operations to Libya and eventually take the lead over a countrywide Libyan rebellion against Gaddafi, or was meant to spark one. This American support for this unit and Habre's support for this unit really irked French authorities. They weren't consulted, they weren't officially informed about it at all, and only kind of through their own context were they informed this unit actually existed. So the French kind of made an unofficial decision that they would not support Habré in the event of a coup d'etat or a rebellion that was not directly backed by a foreign power, or could lead to, say, Libyan expansion into Chad. They would not support Habré, not protect Habré if such a thing happened. Now, that meant that in 1989-1990, when there was such a rebellion led by Hassan Jamous and Idris Deby, France didn't intervene to protect Habré at all. And part of the issue of this rebellion was over dividing the spoils of victory against Libya. So, as part of his national reconciliation efforts, Habré had begun integrating former rebel personnel into his own government. This came at the expense of the old Force Armée Nationale, Force Armée du Nord, I mean. And this included the head of the CDR, Sheikh bin Omar, who became the foreign minister. Also, various Zaghawa officers in the Chadian army had been involved in selling captured Libyan equipment to Sudanese militias, which they viewed as being perfectly their right, following the sacrifice they had made in the war against Libya. But Habré cracked down on this traffic. He executed several Zaghawa officers, and as the Zaghawa were a critical part of the FAN coalition, this undermined Habré's political power. So on April 1st, following an aborted coup attempt, Idris Deby and Hassan Jamous and several others made an overland escape from N'Djamena towards Sudan. They were hunted down by Chadian army troops across the border in Sudan. Jamous was captured, brought to N'Djamena, and summarily executed. Deby, however, managed to organize an armed rebellion from Sudanese territory, just as Habré had done a decade earlier. This time, though, France refused to provide critical assistance to Habré's troops, and the DGSE, France's Foreign Intelligence Service, even provided discreet assistance to Deby. Now, Gaddafi, who was seeking revenge against Habré and hoping for a Chadian government more amenable to negotiations, also supported Deby's movement. So we see kind of a reverse of alliances here, with France and Libya supporting a Chadian rebel, for the French at least unofficially. On December 1st, 1990, Deby's forces entered N'Djamena, and Habré fled Chad, taking a substantial portion of his national treasury with him. And he'd eventually land in Senegal, where he'd live a comfortable life until his arrest over 2 decades later. However, although Gaddafi had helped remove his arch nemesis from power in N'Djamena, he didn't achieve his goals in Ouzou. In 1994, the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of N'Djamena, so ruled in favor of the Chadian position that the Ouzou Strip was entirely Chadian territory. Gaddafi recognized his decision, and he returned Ouzou to Chad, which may seem surprising, but given his international isolation at the time and the lack of international arms supplies comparable to the Soviet Union, it may be that he felt he couldn't sustain another war over it. And this put the nail in the coffin and really ended the Chadian-Libyan conflict, and also began or expanded the kind of increase in friendly relations between Deby and Gaddafi, which would last until Gaddafi's downfall, overthrow in 2011. Now, I'm going to end soon, but I can't end without talking more about Habré. So, Habré was supported by the French and the Americans throughout the 80s. He would lead one of the most brutal dictatorships in post-colonial African history. He led one of the most brutal dictatorships in post-colonial African history, and the legacy of French and American aid needs to be understood as being part of this. Um, Best estimates suggest a death toll of some 40,000 people. Thousands more fell victim to torture at the hands of Habre's secret police, the DDS. French military operations helped to sustain his regime in a multitude of ways and had profound and lasting impacts on Chad's population. Even though Mitterrand didn't like or trust Habré, the fact that they were willing to protect him allowed Habré to do things that he did. The DDS, meanwhile, his intelligence service, benefited from direct French assistance from both the French army and intelligence service. And this included intelligence sharing, training, and probably most damningly, the transport of prisoners condemned to torture or death in French aircraft. Now, in May 2016, the Extraordinary African Chambers, which is an African Union-authorized special criminal tribunal established in Dakar, convicted Habré of crimes against humanity, torture, and war crimes, and his sentence of life in prison was upheld on appeal the following year. It's the first and I think only African leader to be tried and condemned in an African court, which attests both to his loss of political support after his overthrow, but also to the severity and intensity of his crimes. And although many French, not just French diplomats and intelligence officers and military officers in the 80s, but also a lot of African scholars at the time, wrote very positive things about Habré. They saw him, despite his crimes, they saw him as being a potentially unifying figure in Chad, somebody who was the only person to unite the country since the 1960s, somebody who was building an effective state, and who could effectively combat Libyan expansion. And this support to Habré sort of needs to be understood in that kind of that vein. He was seen as nobody saw an alternative to him, but there was a willingness not just to underplay his crimes or downplay his crimes, but in the French case, and to a lesser extent in the American case, to actively abet them. And this is something that is well understood in Chad. The Chadians are well aware of the French and American role in supporting Habré, and in a lot of respects, there remains a lot of resentment, especially towards France, among Chadians, towards not just their support for Habré, but their unceasing support to Idriss Déby, Chad's current president. Now, Operation Appelvier would last for 27 some years, until 2014, when it would merge into Operation Barkhane. Into August, I think, 2014. And it even played a role in both 2006 and 2008 when rebel coalitions led by Mohamed Nouri and Timan El-Dimi launched attacks on Jamena. And in 2008, this included intelligence sharing, force protection through government helicopter gunships, and ammunition resupply. France intervened even more directly in 2019, so that's just 2 years ago, launching a series of devastating airstrikes against rebel columns entering Chad from Libya. And although the Franco-Chadian relationship has waxed and waned over the past 20 years, France's commitment to the security of Déby's regime has had a chilling effect on opposition. And it should be noted that the units that conducted these airstrikes are part of Barkhane, whose mission is not at all, formally anyway, supposed to protect Idriss Déby's regime. It is an operation whose mandate is to combat jihadist groups in the Sahel. But they eliminated a number of rebel columns who could have overthrown Déby, and whether or not this was justified, it certainly sent a signal to both armed and unarmed opposition activists in Chad that France has Déby's back, almost no matter what. So I'm going to end here. The French role in Chad has not ended. As Déby said when he took power in 1990, that he brings Chadian people neither gold nor silver but freedom. He certainly hasn't brought freedom, and the kind of resources brought from oil exports, which have kind of risen and fallen over the years, have largely benefited a small clique of Habré's regime and his military, and particularly the Presidential Guard. And whether or not this kind of governance model is sustainable over the long term is an open question. There's no clear idea about who's going to replace Habré when he goes. And there's a lot of fear among French circles, within French circles, but also I'm sure it's more widely spread, that this could lead to a large amount of instability in Chad or elsewhere, perhaps even a civil war after Deby leaves office or dies. But what I think one has to understand is that any kind of negative outcome resulting from Deby's death and Deby's positioning as a pillar of stability in a region racked by violence and war is coming at the expense of a governance strategy which, for the average Chadian, does not lead to a stable existence, and violence is endemic, both within Chad and without. The Chadian army is a massive committer of human rights violations in the countries where it intervenes, including in Mali and Nigeria. And these kinds of activities may eventually backfire on those who are supporting Deby's regime today. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. That oftentimes France's history in the Sahel and Africa more generally has been one of supporting governments in the name of stability, and then the governance strategies used by those governments to keep themselves in power eventually lead to instability later on down the line. And this needs to be something that should be kept into consideration when examining French policy in the Sahel today. So thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have during our live session.